Nobody talks about what it costs to be right, when the people who were supposed to believe in you were the first ones to bury you, and I almost let them win. My name is Calder Voss, not Cal, not Kale, Calder, the way my grandfather Reuben used to say it, drawing out the first syllable like it carried weight. He was a millwright from Duluth who smelled of iron shavings and pine resin and never once told me what I should or shouldn't be. He died when I was 11. After that, there was nobody left in that house to slow the bleeding. The morning the SAT scores came back, my father, Gregor Voss, was eating soft-boiled eggs at the kitchen table, a ritual so fixed it could have been carved into stone. He had a spreadsheet open on his laptop, not a spreadsheet for work, a spreadsheet for my brother Fennick's football recruitment. Fennick was 2 years older than me, 6'3", already being looked at by programs in the SEC. Gregor called him the return on investment. I thought it was a joke the first time I heard it. It wasn't. I slid the score report across the table without saying a word. Gregor glanced at it, not long enough to actually register the number. He picked it back up a second later with 2 fingers, like the paper was damp, and read it again. He set it back down. He tapped the edge of his spoon against the rim of his bowl twice. Then he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that doesn't involve the eyes, the kind that lives only in the muscles of the lower face. "Save the money for your brother," he said. He went back to his spreadsheet. I stood there for 11 seconds. I counted. I remember thinking that if I moved before 11 seconds were up, something inside me would break that couldn't be repaired. So I stood there and I counted, and I did not move, and I did not cry, and I did not say a single word. My mother, Wren, not Wendy, not Gwendolyn, just Wren. She legally changed it at 32, was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She had heard the whole exchange. She was holding a mug of chamomile tea with both hands, and she was looking at me with an expression I could not then name and cannot now forget. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was something worse. It was a kind of regretful certainty, the look of someone who has already decided how a story ends and is simply watching the pages turn. 3 weeks later, she burned my college applications. Not metaphorically, not she discouraged me from sending them. She took the manila folder I'd kept on my desk, 8 schools, essay drafts, recommendation letter copies, everything, and she carried it to the backyard and she set it on fire in the clay pot we used for burning leaves in autumn. I watched from my bedroom window. She didn't know I was watching. She stood there until the last page curled black and broke apart in the updraft. And then she went back inside and made dinner, like it was a Tuesday, which it was. I was 17 years old. I had nowhere to put what was happening to me, so I put it in a notebook. I wrote down every detail in the kind of handwriting that happens when your hand is moving faster than your thoughts, all jagged and urgent, letters crashing into each other. I filled 63 pages over the following month. When I ran out of space, I started writing smaller. What I never wrote down, because I didn't know how to, was the specific texture of the silence in that house. The way Fennick's trophies lined the mantel like monuments to a theology I'd been excluded from at birth. The way my parents talked around me at dinner, not to me. The way a river navigates around a boulder without stopping to consider the boulder's opinion on the matter. The way Gregor would sometimes look at me across the table with an expression that seemed to say, "I don't dislike you, son, I just don't see you." And somehow, that was the sharpest blade of all. I didn't go to college that September. I took a job at a warehouse on the eastern edge of the city, a parts distribution center for agricultural machinery. The work was loud and physical and completely indifferent to everything I was carrying inside me, which turned out to be exactly what I needed. My supervisor was a man named Otway, bald by choice and tattooed from collarbone to wrist with constellations he'd mapped himself. He never asked about my plans. He handed me a set of tasks every morning and trusted me to complete them. That, too, was exactly what I needed. I lived in a room above a dry cleaner's on Parrish Street. The rent was $415 a month. The walls smelled of perchloroethylene, and the radiator had one temperature, scalding. But the window faced east, and every morning the light came through it in a particular slanted way that made even that small, ugly room feel briefly like a place where something was possible. In the evenings, after my shift, I read. Not for any credential or course requirement, just read, voraciously and without order. Keynes, followed by Borges, followed by a manual on options theory, followed by a memoir by a Mongolian long-distance writer, followed by a translation of Seneca's letters. I was looking for something. I didn't know what it was, only that I hadn't found it yet, only that the not finding was itself a kind of compass. Then I found the markets. It happened sideways, the way most important things happen. A coworker named Draven, 24, originally from Tulsa, had an obsessive interest in mechanical keyboards and futures contracts, left a book on the break room table. I picked it up without asking. It was dense and badly typeset, and absolutely riveting to me in a way I cannot fully explain. It was about the structure of price, about how markets aggregate information in real time, about the gap between what something is worth and what it's trading for, and the brief, violent moment in which those two values converge. Something clicked. Not a metaphorical click, a physical sensation in the center of my chest, the way a deadbolt sounds when it finds the right key. I spent 6 months reading everything. I spent another 2 months watching. I spent another month paper trading, obsessively tracking every entry and exit, building a journal that made my teenage notebooks look casual. I had almost no money. My warehouse savings were thin, my margins for error essentially non-existent. But I had something that turns out to matter more than money at the start, which is time and compulsive attention. My instrument was the MNQ, the Micro E-mini NASDAQ, small enough that a 22-year-old eating $40 groceries could actually participate without catastrophic downside on a bad day. Big enough to teach you everything that matters about how price moves, about liquidity, about structure, about the way institutional order flow leaves tracks in the tape if you learn to look for them correctly. I was not immediately good at this. Let me be precise about that. My first 3 months of live trading were a study in what it looks like to learn expensive lessons quickly. I blew a small account. I rebuilt it. I blew it again, less badly. I rebuilt it again. I kept the journal running, every trade annotated, every decision examined, every loss interrogated with a rigor I applied to nothing else in my life. The journal became something like a continuous letter to a version of myself that didn't yet exist, the version who understood what was happening. Slowly, incrementally, with reversals and corrections and periods of genuine doubt, something began to resolve. A prop firm gave me capital. Not the first one I applied to, the second. I passed the evaluation on the 3rd attempt. The account wasn't large by the standards of people who'd been doing this for a decade, but it was real capital, real risk parameters, real P&L that mattered. I treated it accordingly. I moved from the room above the dry cleaners into a slightly larger room 2 blocks away. Same neighborhood, different smell. I traded from a setup that would have embarrassed most serious traders. A 6-year-old laptop propped on a dictionary, a secondary monitor I'd bought secondhand and had to tilt 12 degrees to compensate for a dead column of pixels. The setup was irrelevant. The edge was in the process, not the equipment. 18 months after I left that warehouse, I was profitable on the year by a number I still do not tell people, because I have learned that numbers change how people see you before they understand the context that produced them. What I will say is this: it was enough. Enough to stop calculating whether I could afford to replace my shoes. Enough to feel, for the first time in my adult life, like the ground beneath me was made of something other than faith and stubbornness. I called nobody to tell them. Not because I was spiteful, though I will not pretend spite was entirely absent from my operating system during those years, but because the achievement felt private in a way that sharing would have damaged. It was mine. I had built it in the early mornings and the late nights of a room that smelled of chemicals, and it belonged to me the way very few things in my life had ever belonged to me. And I wanted to hold it for a while before I let the world touch it. November arrived. Thanksgiving arrived with it. My mother called the first week of the month to say the family was gathering at my Aunt Colette's house in Millhaven, a drive of about 3 hours. She said it casually, the way you say things when you're not sure whether you're extending an invitation or just conveying information. I said I'd come. The silence on her end of the line told me she hadn't expected that. Aunt Colette's house was a wide craftsman on a street lined with oaks that had been losing their leaves for weeks, red and amber and brown on the ground, still orange on the branches, the whole thing looking like a fire that was slowly deciding whether to keep burning. Inside, the smell of turkey fat and sage, the sound of football on the television in the den, Gregor's voice carrying from some other room. Fenwick met me in the entryway. He'd put on weight since last I'd seen him. Not the bad kind, the kind that comes from lifting seriously. He looked at me the way people look at something they're trying to read before it reads them. "You look different," he said. "So do you," I said. We did not hug. We never had. But there was something in that moment, a small acknowledgement of shared survival. Two people who had grown up in the same house under radically different circumstances and had somehow both reached adulthood without becoming the people that house had sometimes seemed designed to produce. Dinner was the performance it always was. Gregor held court. Colette's husband, a quiet man named Sutter, nodded at everything and said little. The cousins moved through the periphery of the adults' conversation like satellites in a low orbit. My mother sat across from me and watched me with the same unreadable expression she'd had in the kitchen doorway 3 years earlier, the one I still couldn't name. I ate. I did not fill the silence with anything. I had learned in those 20 months of solitary work that silence, correctly deployed, is not an absence, it's a form of pressure. And I was in no hurry. Dessert was on the table. Colette made a persimmon pudding that was genuinely extraordinary, dark and dense and fragrant with clove, when the phone rang. The ring was startling in the specific way that a phone ringing in a quiet house always is, even when you're expecting it intellectually, even when you know phones ring. It cut through the conversation like a blade. Nobody moved for a moment. My mother was closest to the handset. An actual landline, corded. Colette had kept it for reasons nobody had ever questioned. Wren picked it up on the third ring. What happened to her face over the next 90 seconds is something I will never forget as long as I live. I had seen my mother's face in grief, when Reuben died, when her own mother died 3 years after that. I had seen it in anger. I had seen it in the controlled, calibrated blankness she used when she wanted to communicate disapproval without the expenditure of emotion. I had never seen what happened to it now. The color left it, not gradually, quickly, like a tide pulling back from a shore all at once. Her hand, the one not holding the phone, went to the edge of the table. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone senses that something is happening that has not happened before. "You mean," she said. Her voice was unrecognizable, not frightened exactly, fractured. "You mean, my son?" She looked at me. The whole table looked at me. The person on the other end of the line said something I couldn't hear. My mother said nothing for 5 full seconds, and then she put the phone down without saying goodbye, which was the most unlike her thing I had ever witnessed. She turned to face me, full on, completely, the way she almost never did. Her eyes were bright in the terrible way that happens just before someone cries, when the liquid is at the surface but not yet released. "That was the Northfield Foundation," she said. I knew what it was. I had applied 7 months earlier, a fellowship for young, independent researchers, writers, and thinkers who had pursued serious work outside institutional settings. The application had required 3 letters of reference, a project statement, and a body of work. I had submitted my trading journals, edited, annotated, converted into something that read like a serious investigation into microstructure theory and behavioral economics, alongside a 30-page essay on what price discovery actually is and why most people who trade for a living have never genuinely thought about it. I had told no one I applied. "They want to offer you a 2-year fellowship," my mother said. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. Research funding. They said they haven't given it to someone outside academia in 11 years. The table was absolutely still. Gregor had put down his fork. Fennec was looking at me with something I had never seen on his face before. Not pride. He didn't know enough yet for it to be pride, but something adjacent. Recognition, maybe. The first tentative acknowledgement that there was something here he hadn't mapped. I looked at my mother. I let the silence hold for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then I said, very quietly, "I know." "You knew?" she said. "They called me 2 weeks ago. I asked them to call this number today." She sat down. Just sat. Not pulled out the chair deliberately, but sat, the way you sit when your legs decide for you. What I had wanted for 3 years, what I had rehearsed in my head in the early mornings of that small, chemical-smelling room, was some version of triumph, some clean, satisfying delivery of vindication, a moment where the score was settled and the record corrected. What I felt instead was something much more complicated and much harder to name, something closer to grief than to satisfaction, because she was my mother. And I had loved her even when she'd stood in that yard and watched the pages burn, and I had never once stopped, and that love had turned out to be one of the most painful things I'd ever carried. I looked at her for a long time. "I'm not here to win anything," I said. "I just want you to know that I was always going to be fine." She cried then, not politely, not the controlled, managed weeping of a woman who cried strategically. Really cried. The ugly, ragged kind, in front of Colette and Sutter and the cousins and Gregor, who sat like a man who has walked into a room he does not know how to leave. I let her. Later, after dessert, after the cousins had drifted to other rooms, after Gregor had stepped outside and not come back in for 40 minutes, Fennec found me on the back porch. The oak leaves were down here too. The evening was cold and clear, the sky the deep blue of very late dusk. He stood beside me and we looked at the yard. "I didn't know," he said after a while. "I know," I said. "I should have," he started. "Don't," I said, not unkindly. "We're okay." And the strange thing, the thing I could not have predicted from the vantage point of that 17-year-old standing at a kitchen table counting seconds, was that it was true. We were okay. Not because everything had been resolved or because old wounds had been surgically closed, but because I had learned, in those long, solitary months, that you don't need the people who underestimated you to acknowledge their error in order to become who you were always going to become. The becoming is its own answer. I drove home that night through 3 hours of dark highway. The NASDAQ had a big week coming. Economic data, Fed minutes, a batch of earnings from the mega-cap names that always move the index with a peculiar violence. I had levels mapped, hypotheses formed, risk parameters set. Tomorrow morning, I would sit down in front of that tilted secondhand monitor, and I would read the tape, and I would do the work. Nobody would see it. Nobody would call. The room would be quiet, and the market would open, and I would be there, in the one place that had never asked me to be anything other than precise. It was enough. It was more than enough. If this story hit something real in you, smash that like and subscribe. This channel is just getting started and you don't want to miss what's coming.